Hi, I'm CJ Sorensen, and I've started a new program called CJ's Chatbox. The reason being, I would like to know some of the people here in the village at a deeper, more personal level. Many of the people here have got such interesting lives and experiences to share, and I think they should be shared with the people here that live in the village. So, welcome. Maybe you're one of those people. If so, give me a call. Maybe you'll be my next guest on CJ's Chatbox.
We're rolling, go ahead.
Okay. Welcome to CJ's Chatbox. Today we have a special guest. He's a friend of mine, and he's also a journalist. He's a war correspondent. He is a theologian, and he's also an author. And we're going to talk a bit about his books today. And we're going to kind of do them out of order, only because I think that will set the place a little bit. So welcome, Uwe Simeonetto. Okay? So we're going to talk about your first, well, not your first book, but the book that I think really helps shape you, helps me get to know what made you who you are. So if you could talk a little bit about the urchin at war.
Well, read it with a subtitle, and that tells you a little more. It's the tale of a Leipzig rascal, my hometown was Leipzig, a tale of a Leipzig rascal and his Lutheran granny under bombs in Nazi Germany. Because it's a story I have never read in American or English language literature. What was it like for a child to be in Nazi Germany under bombs? Mm-hmm. Not being of a Nazi family, just a regular bourgeois family in Nazi. Did you have a childhood? You know, yes, I did. Mm-hmm. A very weird childhood, but not as weird as a childhood kids have today. Mm-hmm. I didn't spend it behind computers. I played in the streets, in ruins, in smoking ruins after bombardments. And I'm developing, and my entire character, as it is, was formed, of course, by this background, and of course, I was mainly formed by my very powerful maternal grandmother, Mother Clara Netto, who was the sort of German equivalent of, if you know watch Downton Abbey, of Lady Violet, the Dowager Countess. You know, she was as loudmouth as that woman, as straightforward, as honest, and she had the fastest hands this side of Texas. I mean, the fast clips like that, we weren't snowflakes those days, I tell you that. We were disciplined, and I never held it against her. It's the one person that I truly trusted, and there was no other person I trusted as much as that until I met my wife, with whom I'm now married, have been married for 59 years. So my parents and I, it was an interesting story. My father was blind from the First World War. Nonetheless, he was blinded at the age of 18 and still went to university, became a lawyer, got his doctorate, became juvenile delinquency attorney in the DA's office in Leipzig. I'm talking now pre-war and pre-Hitler. And we were bombed out in 1943. And I had to actually guide one of the more interesting scenes in my book. I had to guide my father over puddles of green flames, because we bombed out the phosphor turns into green flames, and you can't extinguish it with water. You needed sand with that. Where do you find sand? We didn't. Leipzig wasn't nowhere near the beach, so I had to hop with my blind father over the flames. And there were people running around and flames coming up their legs, and women falling, coming out of burning houses, burning themselves, and kids going around wrapping blankets around them. And I brought them, my father, to my grandmother, who wasn't bombed out. She lived about a couple of miles from us in the southern part of Leipzig. We lived downtown Leipzig. And there we waited for my mother to join us. My mother had stayed behind to extinguish the flames, but she couldn't, because you can't extinguish phosphor flames unless you have sand, which she didn't know. She knew Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and English and French and all sorts of things, and was a wonderful musician, but she understood nothing of chemistry and physics. And we waited, and Constance, that is something that you will not, Americans might not understand, but this is wartime. We had been at war with France, okay? Leipzig was very pro-French, very Francophile, and my family, especially my mother's side, extremely Francophile. I spoke French as a child as well as German. At 4 o'clock, 4 Frenchmen showed up at my granny's house with one of those apple carts, you know, what the apple carts which you sell fruit, vegetables, stuff like that in the street. They had found that. My mother on top, now she blind and unconscious. She was blind from smoke, only temporarily, clutching our 17th century family Bible on her belly. And they carried my mother, Frenchmen. They carried my mother into my granny's living room and stretched her out on the sofa. And I had to translate for my grandmother, because my granny's French wasn't very good, what had happened. These guys, obviously they must have known, I had a French nanny before that, and they must have known the French nanny, and these were workers, and forced laborers mainly, but they lived in, they had the freedom of the city, they could move about, and they lived in a home very near to where our house stood. And mysteriously they came straight, when the all clear was sounded, they came straight to our house, raised up the burning staircase, we were on the 3rd floor, walked into our apartment, and in our music room, my mother was a singer, she had a large music room with all, and the music room was already burning, flames eating up our ancestors going back to the 16th century. And my mother lying under the grand piano, unconscious, with the family Bible on her belly. And the French said to her, and this is I have to say this in French person, and I was trying to Courage, madame, il est fort temps de partir. Have courage, lady, but it's high time to leave. And my mother wakes up and says, mais d'abord, il faut que je vous fasse un café, but first I have to make you a cup of coffee. In a burning apartment! And she had immersion heater, and she had mineral water, and she had coffee. But it was so Saxon. Saxons are the ultimate coffee drinkers. Bach wrote a coffee cantata, one of the most beautiful secular cantatas about coffee. And Bach wrote this in Leipzig, of course. So, and as she was trying to make coffee, of course, the ceiling came down burning, and the Frenchman yanked her up, threw her on their backs, and he carried her down the stairs to the upper cart, and then brought them to my grandmother. And this is really where my life, most memorable parts of my childhood took place. My grandmother and the whole family squeezed into a 5-room apartment. It was large by today's standards, but small in those days. But she was alone. And we spent our nights in the air raid shelter, which meant the potato and coal cellars in between the two, with bunk beds. And my grandmother dictating manners down there. There was one thing nobody in her family, least of all her grandson, was allowed to do. When the bombs fell and the walls cracked open, the smoke came in, the fire came in, you were not allowed to twitch, you were not allowed to express any fear, because my grandmother said, this is unchristian and definitely ungentlemanly. I don't allow this. See, Lady Violet.
Yeah.
You don't do this sort of thing, and I didn't. And this is an episode I hope that you will run in this thing, because she lived at the crossings of several tram lines, and so you never knew who came into the house when the first alarm was sounded. The first alarm was sounded, the trams had to be cleared, the conductor and the driver had to disperse the passengers to the various cellars in surrounding buildings. And so you had all sorts of people there you didn't know. We knew the people in our building, but we didn't know obviously the people who came in. And one day, I remember one night, there was a group of what we used to call gold pheasants. Gold pheasants were Nazi party pen pushers. They weren't the Gestapo, they weren't SS or anything, they were just bookkeepers for the Nazi party, but they were rewarded with light from uniforms, lots of tinsel dangling, this is what we call them, gold pheasants, from their shoulders. And they were the only fat Germans who had during the war. Everybody else was pretty skinny because we were starving by that time. And the minute the first bomb dropped in the neighborhood, missing us, didn't miss the house next door, apartment buildings, they shrieked and screamed. Nobody else did in the basement. Wouldn't have, my granny wouldn't. She was a woman about that high, but she wouldn't allow that. Of course, would she call them to task? So she had been praying and singing hymns, the wonderful Lutheran hymn, Abide, O dearest Jesus. And she stopped, lowered her lorgnette, stared at him and said, Aber meine Herren, but gentlemen. Ach nein, Herren sind Sie ja nicht. Ach, Gentlemen you're not. Männer also. Da bin ich auch nicht so sicher. Männer, nur I'm not so sure either. Whatever you are, pull yourselves together. This is your war, not ours. We here have nothing against the English, the French, the Jews, the Americans, the Russians. They're all God's children. Nothing against them. You wanted this, so now you cooked your soup, you eat it, here, and stay quiet. Don't set a bad example to my grandson here. He doesn't allow it, but you don't see him because he was shrieking. Next morning the Gestapo were there. I know, I had to open the door. 8 o'clock sharp, and in leather coats, black leather coats, all the way down to their shoes. It's Frau Netto here. Yeah, but you can't see her. Why not? She's doing her devotions. She is talking to a higher boss than you. So then my granny did her devotions. She had a ritual, a liturgy to herself. And then she came out and said, yes, gentlemen, can I help you? Well, you were overheard making seditious remarks, which was capital crime. And she said, of course I don't. They're God's children. And we're a Christian family here. This is what we learn in catechism. God's children. I don't hate them. I don't want them. I didn't ask the guy you elected. I didn't. I'm a monarchist. I believe in the King of Saxony, oldest dynasty we had in Germany. Where he is, Frederick the Wise, Luther's protector, was part of that dynasty, or dynasty, you say in American. So if you think this is seditious, then you must, by all means, arrest me. Try me before People's Court. And she stretched her hand out like this. And they ran. And my grandmother ran after them and said, "Come back, I'm not through with you." And then she said, "Birgit, yes, Mrs. Netter, what is it now? Why are your spies, so your informers, so fat? Why don't you send them to the Eastern Front? They'll lose some weight there fast." We never had the guest house back in our house. Never had. I mean, you cannot believe it. Now, it's another thing, an experience, I had many experiences. The word Hitler, National Socialism, Nazis stood for National Socialist German Workers' Party, were not permitted to be mentioned inside our house. There was her apartment was a mighty fortress against, and she was as Lutheran as can be. My God, I mean, Martin would have been proud of her. You know how she countered whatever indoctrination I might have received at school, although there wasn't much of it, which countered it by sitting me down and studied with me Luther's small catechism. I had to learn it by heart. And I had to learn the genealogy of the German royal family, the Saxon royal family, and of the Prussians as well, although the Prussians were more or less the enemy, but not during that war. But it was absolutely, and there were so many, and this was one of them. So now, after one service, we went back to the parsonage and we had lunch. I was always beaten up because I used French terms, which the Leipzig bourgeoisie did in those days. Every time I used a word like serviette for a napkin or so, bum bum, you know, they had brand new words the Nazis had cooked up that I'd never heard before. And then after lunch I went to the garden, the parsonage garden, to steal some apples. And because I was hungry. And I came back and to find the entire pastor's family, the pastor, his fat wife, and their 4 children on the floor, clipping the photographs of Nazi hotshots out of the daily newspapers. Well, the reason was, of course, as it turns out, in those days you didn't have a toilet. It wasn't like now with COVID, you know, suddenly you had no toilet paper. All we did was using newspapers. So now, you know, there comes the funny part. They clipped, so so as to not soil Hitler's face with our excrements, he clipped them out. So when a few months later I went home to Leipzig and my granny couldn't tolerate it. When I told her what happened, she said, "You stay here. We either live together or die together. But you're staying here." Anyway, and I told her this incident, and she laughed and said, "Well, we're doing the same thing, but look at the kitchen. We do it the other way around. Look at the bathroom. In the bathroom, instead of toilet paper, we had clippings out of the Nazi newspapers, and we only had Nazi newspapers, and not any others." But only Hitler and Goering and Goebbels and all the Nazi horses, no text, it's just these guys. So the opposite number. These were little ways of opposition. It was a form of resistance.
Yeah. One of the things I find so interesting, and for anyone that, after the stories that you have been telling, which you have a million of them, but to read in the book, you write like you speak, which I find absolutely enchanting. Because if you've ever heard you speak when you read your book, you hear your voice, but you also keep that same language you use your storytelling. And the fact that your grandmother had such a strong, and I'm assuming it is the faith that kept her so strong that she could, but also that influence that again showed you when
faith and upbringing. You know.
Yes, when you were brought to that school, you knew right away that they were wrong because your granny was right. And also when you talk about the kind of prankster you and your friends were.
Oh yeah.
To me, that is just astounding that you could have a childhood with those kind of memories of being pranksters and the trams and doing the things you did that were just so. But even though it was this horrendous time in your life,
Well, let me
war.
Yeah, let me tell you what we did, for example. And you know, you won't believe it. We were that high. We were 7, 8 years old.
Yeah.
We stole streetcars. We stole trams.
I love that.
And we did something very wicked. I mean, you see, as I said, there were 4 tram lines crossing outside my grandmother's house, and the drivers, the trams had to stop immediately, of course, with the first alarm, and then we watched, because they were supposed to take the handles off, you know, the handle that
when they left
forward, that you have to
their
move forward and arms brakes and you know, the brakes, and this was the air kind. Anyway, they were supposed to take them out. Sometimes they were so rusty, these were old machines. At the times they were turn of the century, but because so many of them had been destroyed during the war. But interestingly enough, the trams always function. It's amazing how quickly they worked. Even to the bombing, even if the streets were a mess, they cleaned them up until the next thing as they rolled. So anyway, I cannot tell you how hard my granny slapped my face. She cuffed me, and she said, "I'm cuffing you not because you are a prankster. That's good. That makes you human. That makes you a real boy, you know. But these poor people, you would make life hard for them, and that is not. And they are lower class people. They are working class people. You have to make their life easier for them, not harder.
Oh.
So you're not behaving like a gentleman. You can be gentleman prankster, that's allowed, but not on the backs of these people. So that's what I never did. But I did something else. As I said, there were these rubble trains. They were all through Leipzig. There were several lines, and they had some had diesel engines, but diesel engines you can switch off and you turn a key, and that was it. One day my friend Gerhard came to me and said, "Ooh, comes now. I found a steam engine, and the steam's still on, and it's still under steam. Let's go, let's steal it." And he was the son of a locomotive driver of the German National Railways, so he knew a bit about steam engines. But you have to drive this thing, and I'll tell you what to do. So I put the lever down too much, and it shot forward the steam engine, and it derailed. You know, and I said, "Let's hop before the thing keels over." And there was a tram coming up from the downtown. I said, "Let's hop the tram, quick. One stop, and then jump off." And then I sauntered into the kitchen, and Granny said, "Well, you're home early." I said, "Well, it was boring out there." This is the sort of stuff. Yes, we had a childhood, in other words. Yeah.
But here's the thing that in your sharing about the fact that your granny, even though she was, again, patting you on the back for being the prankster, but also understanding what could come from that, meaning that you're hurting other people. Yeah, that kind of life lesson.
That is not allowed. It's in a very one thing. If I may inject one bit of Lutheran theology here, because it is essential to understand this. Luther taught that every Christian is called by God to serve his neighbor in his vocation. In other words, if you're if you're a plumber. In what you're already doing, as long as you do it in the service of your neighbor, then you're rendering the God. One of the most, the Lutheran doctrine of vocation is very beautiful. One of the reasons why German products, or the Lutheran products, Swedish, etc., or used to be so well crafted, still are in many ways.
But before
let me just finish that, because because I'm talking
Yes,
then
yeah.
about setting an example.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, the reason why we even laughed during Aries, Granny and I and our family, was to cheer up the other. We were all scared, obviously, but
Right.
we were not allowed to show it, and it was, of course, an act of faithlessness.
Oh.
So we cheered, and the others laughed too.
Oh.
And my grandmother made me understand that you can do anything legal and something illegal, like, for example, hamstering food from the countryside. You can do all these things, but never at the expense of other people, and especially not at the expense of people who have to work that much harder than you and are much less blessed by coming from old families as we did.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, everyone has got to read the whole book to understand the importance of what your grandmother taught you and the faith building that she did during that time. And yet you lived a kind of, I would hate to say normal childhood, but it does sound normal even though you
real childhood, not normal.
Well, it was
real.
A real childhood because you did have a good time, you laughed, you were taught lessons.
Real childhood.
You weren't just hiding in a bomb shelter the whole time. You
Shivering,
You had other things that were going on. But I want to go into why you got into being a journalist. How did you, once you, when did you go to school? When did you go to college? When did you decide to become a...
I went to university later at the age of 50. By the time I was 19, I was a trainee reporter at a major, listen, because of the war and the post-war period in the division of Germany, and I had to flee then from East Germany because Leipzig was then occupied by the Russians, and Christians and upper class families were very much discriminated against by often the very same people who had terrorized us in the Nazi era. You know, not the similar people, the same people, same personalities. So in all, in Germany you have 13 years of schooling, and you don't have college. You go straight from high school then to graduate school. Okay. In France too, by the way, that's standard. In those 13 years, I went to 14 different schools. Occasionally, the schools I attended, like my first school, my first primary school, wasn't there. It was bombed out the same day the night we were bombed out. And to my father's great joy, half of his courthouse, so he didn't have to go to work. He hated being a lawyer, but he had no choice. He was a blind man. So I became, and I was F'd in mathematics because of this, and because one day I was that school and different school systems, and East German school first in the traditional school system, and still under Nazi years, some with or some without Nazi teachers. Then village school, then boarding school under Rudolf Steiner school, which was totally different ideology or religion. Christian community was called from Lutheranism, a totally different outlook. Strange religion. Anyway, so I went through there. So in certain subjects, I simply got lost in. Mathematics was one of them. Strangely, because I do believe I have a mathematical mind, because to me, Bach's music, which is and my favorite piece of music is the most abstract piece, which I learned as a child, is the art of the fugue. I learned actually at school boarding school, how to write a fugue. I've forgotten it, of course. I can barely read music, but I can read a hymnal. But I was so bad. On the other hand, some subjects I was marvelous: languages and history, and German, obviously, music. religion, which is taught at public schools in Germany still to this day. So anyway, then the headmaster was so bad that my mathematics teacher, whom we called the hopper because he was another one-legged army veteran, he was a poor bastard, but we hopped about, so we called him the hopper hüpfen. And since I couldn't, every time we had a quiz, I drew another cartoon of him and handed it in instead of the quiz results. Yeah. And he wrote into the, I've got to quote this to you, this is at least up to my, how to get a journalist. He wrote into the class book, grinding my teeth, I give Uwe a 6 because it is the worst grade allowed under the laws of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. He deserves a 7. So, in the class book. So, anyway, but then the headmaster called me and said, "Oh, what do you want to be?" And I said, "Well, I really want to be a journalist, and I want to study art, drawing, caricatures. I still am good at caricatures, sculpture, and abstract art." And actually won admission to the art school. As his suggestion, he said, "Well, why don't you go to art school? Go down to Munich, go to art school, pass your exam, see if they accept you." Then, of course, the professor I wanted to study under went off to Paris, but that is another, he went on sabbatical first. That was another deal. In preceding that, since the age of 15, 16, I hadn't, well, the English would say I didn't have a pot to piss in. I had no money. My only true form of enjoyment was going to a local modern art museum. It was one of the best in Germany. It was in the industrial city of Hagen, but they have called Karl Ernst Oswald, wonderful stuff, and always new exhibitions, and fabulous. And I really rejoiced. I came home from school, I had to go by train to school, home from school and popped in and sopped it up like that. And then I went to the notice of the local newspaper called Westfalen Post, which comes up in a second again. Never ran anything on that museum. So I was a 15-year-old kid, woolly-headed, and walked into the cultural editor's office. And he looked at me and said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm Uwe Simonello." "Well, what are you here for?" I said, "Why don't you do anything about the Karl Ernst Oswald Museum, about their fabulous exhibitions?" He said, "You know something about modern art? Yeah, here's a piece of paper, here's a pencil, you start writing." I have nobody on my staff who understands modern art. And so I wrote a few pieces for them. Because the art professor in Munich, under whom I wanted to study, called Marx Müller, had a sabbatical. I went first to England to improve my English skill, and then went from England to France and worked there painting a monastery from the inside, and also had marvelous jobs. And one day my mother, who, as I said, was a singer, went to see the cultural editor to discuss one of her concerts with him. And he said, "By the way, where's your son? You're the mother of this guy, Uwe, this little kid here." "Yeah, well, why? I don't get any copy from him anymore." She said, "Well, he's in Paris, and I don't think you'll get him back." He said, "Well, listen, we have 3 openings for as trainee editors positions. Very tough. This is grinding, really. 2 years of tough training in the local journalism. Every local nonsense that had to be done, and you around the pampa. This is how I learned journalism. It's on the local newspaper. Everything from layouting, photographing, developing films, writing my texts, being the layout editor, everything. I did everything. Critiquing operas, all sorts of things. Really had a fantastic training, and there were 20 candidates for these 3 positions. There had 3 positions open, and I was one of the 3 who was admitted, even though I didn't even have a proper school leaving certificate because of my mathematical skills, or the lack thereof. Then I really enjoyed this. I really felt at home. I ran around. I suddenly felt I saw a future for myself, and I was always since my childhood, filled with curiosity. And a proper journalist, that's the first thing. You don't go around telling people what they have to say and whom to have their vote for, and how they have to think. You go out, sniff out the stories, research and write and inform people, so they can make. And this is how we were trained. I was a very traditionally trained reporter.
No.
And then joined the Associated Press when I finished my training as a junior reporter in Frankfurt. And I stayed there for 3.5 years. My most important assignment was covering the construction of the Berlin Wall. Not the coming down, that too I did 40 years later. Construction of the Berlin Wall, 13th of August 1961, 60 years ago. And because of my feature stories about life in the newly divided Berlin, life at the wall, and life and death of people dying at the wall, and all that sort of thing, and having been arrested by the Stasi on the other side of the wall, and it was quite dramatic, I became, at the age of 24, quite famous in Germany, actually worldwide, because I wrote both in English and in German. Then the largest German publishing house, Axel Springer, invited me to join them they heard that I wanted to become a foreign correspondent. And so I was sent to London in '62, London, Paris, and then New York. In London I met my wife, but still married. We married in New York, and Cuban Missile Crisis, that's why I wound up in New York, and then the Kennedy assassination after that, President Kennedy's assassination, Jack Ruby trial. This will come in a later edition of this, edition of this book. Not edition later, the volume of this series of memoirs, and then Vietnam War.
That's where I mean that procession of coming to New York and then the JFK assassination, the Bay of Pigs, etc., and how that again led to your Vietnam experience, because you were on the ground covering the war correspondence for 5 years, was it?
I was on the ground, yes, I was here. This shows me, this is my Vietnam book, Triumph of the Absurd. This was me in 1968, February of 1968, after 2 weeks of heavy duty in house-to-house combat in Hue. Which is the city where they found. I was there when the mass graves were found, and it was a gruesome battle. Anyway, and I was there. I covered the war. I fought with the Americans, with the South Vietnamese, and in many ways, I think this much later in my life caused me to attend, to go to seminary, and then ultimately get my doctorate in theology and sociology.
Right, and then that's one of your other books, The Acquittal, that we'll talk about later. But one of the things that I found really interesting in the fact that when I introduced you to some of the vets that meet as a support group up at the Laguna Cafe, that when I introduced you to them, and you started talking about the different experiences that you'd had, what I found frighteningly awful, I guess I would say, is the fact that when you spoke of some of those memories, the mass grave, the 500, etc., that were just buried there with the women's fingers coming out, they were ready to.
They were buried alive.
Yes.
Alive, and of course this was Tet, China, Vietnamese New Year, and the highest holiday in Vietnam. Everybody gets to be a year older that day. It's like Christmas and everything lumped into one. And so they had their nails beautifully manicured, and you could see, and these were nobility and bourgeoisie and, people, so they were people from upper notch families, and you could see their hands as they tried to claw their way out of their graves until they collapsed. Yeah. This is like asparagus. It was like asparagus. Yeah. You know?
But when you were talking about that, about and I could see and hear the other vets there shaking their heads in agreement, remembering what you were remembering. And the other thing that absolutely, again, gave me chills is the fact that you said, and again, one of the guys said, yeah, I had the same experience. You said, I could not take enough showers. I did not want to get close and intimate with my wife. I still could not get the smell of death out of me.
And
I just was watching American Veteran on PBS, and one of the vets says, when I came home, my mother made me wash with bleach. She just continued to make me wash with bleach, and my clothes and my everything, which she could smell. And I never heard someone say that they could not get rid of the smell of death. And that was, but again, that commonality of the vets, that they knew what you were talking about because you all walked in the same shoes. You all had the same experiences, the horrible memories. They understood why you wrote the book you did, but also in preparation for writing The Acquittal of God was your experience there as on the grounds. But then what you decided, as you said, to get into theology, and then spent some of that internship, if you will, at the St. Cloud
called clinical pastoral education.
And that, when you write about that, and one of the vets that well, I think they all got the book, but the one vet, Renee, that had gotten The Acquittal of God, when he got to meet you and brought the book because he wanted you to sign it, but when he opened his book, everything was yellow marked, underlined, because he related to everything you were talking about. And having someone, again, at this late day and age, understand there's somebody there that remembers, that somebody there that feels as I still feel, and they're feeling like, is anybody ever going to say welcome home? That feeling that they have, and their disgust over Walter Cronkite, that they all right away, when you said something about he ruined everything by saying what he said and telling the American public something that was not true.
Well, Walter Cronkite, you see, he flew in much later. Of course, he flew in fancy. You see, he came in, and I don't know where he got his uniform. He got his fatigues from. They were freshly pressed and everything looked clean. We stank like wet foxes, I tell you. I'd worn 3 sets of fatigues on top of each other because it was cold up in Wales during that period. And I stank. I knew I couldn't. It took me hours to shower. Black stuff came down my body in a shower in the press club in Da Nang, and then before I returned to Hue. This was after 2 weeks of combat. And Cronkite flew in, and he grandly and then he announced to the readers, to the listeners rather, the telespectators, that this war, it was his conviction that this war was unwinnable, and this is when LBJ is supposed to have said, Lyndon Baines Johnson, is supposed to have said, I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. And that was de facto the end of the war.
Yeah. Well, and again, we're back to that whole political thing.
Yeah.
We have GIs over there dying
Yeah.
to for our freedoms,
Yeah.
and then you have politics over here calling shots they know nothing about. That again, they're over there, and when they came home, they said the billboards that would be showing, vets are shooting up and killing babies and all. That's what they were greeted with when
Yeah,
they
they call
came
them
back.
baby killers. Yeah, there you go. Well, there's one particular. You'll find that the acquittal of God was actually my MA thesis on
Okay.
At the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. There's one scene I had three different groups of I was chaplain intern, and then there were two shrinks. Yeah, two shrinks. We had groups of veterans to talk over their problems with them. And then at one point I went over to see Eberhard Bethge. Eberhard Bethge was Dietrich Bonhoeffer's closest collaborator and friend.
Okay.
And so I discussed this thing with him, and he suggested then which text I should use, Bonhoeffer text, as a theological basis of my discussions. And we had this text after 10 years. It's called After 10 Years. It's the prologue to what is the text in English? Prison papers. Prison papers. In German is Widerstand. Anyway, and so these guys who were not practicing Christians. They were believers, but they thought that God had already rejected them. You see. And they were eternally damned by God. And I had to tell them, no, quite the opposite is true.
Yeah.
God is walking, as Bonhoeffer said, it's the Christian's duty to walk with God in a godless world. Which means that God is walking with you in a godless world. And so you have to understand your fellow sufferers are suffering with God in a godless world. And that is actually suffering with God in a godless world. And they understood this. They cottoned on to that. Now there was one guy in my group. He had come into... many of these guys were hiding in the bushes and out in this was in Minnesota, Minnesota. They were hiding out and no choice. And it's people like that. There were people, this guy I drove up, the Minnesota Riviera.
Up near Duluth area?
Duluth,
North Shore.
North Shore.
Yeah.
And so I tootled up in my Volkswagen Golf. And it was in 1987, I was very thirsty. And I dropped into a barn, had a good beer, and I stood next to a guy, and he had this sort of, I could immediately identify him as a Vietnam vet. He had a sort of defiant look about him. He said, "You're thirsty, what?" And then we discussed, and I said, "What are you doing here?" I'm chaplain with Vietnam veterans. Hey, you want to see what it's like? I'll tell you what it's like. Now we'll be following. So he had one of those four-wheeler motorbikes, and he lived in the jungle. He had a jungle camp, Concertina all around him. It turned out he had been a baker, I think, from Minneapolis or somewhere. Who was rejected by society, rejected by his family, by his wife. Everybody left him, and he said, "Well, to hell with all of you. I go back into the jungle, where I know how to defend myself, with guns. So follow me and meet my kids. My kids are with me in the summer for summer vacation." And I followed him in my Volkswagen Golf and got stuck. Was muddy there in the woods. He said, "Wait here, I have a Jeep, I'll pull you out." And he came back, and I sat in the car, and it took a while. He came back with a Jeep, and suddenly he pointed a 45 at my head,
Oh my stars.
through my window, the window open. I don't want you to see. I don't want to. You tell my kids that I'm a murderer. That I said I never thought you were a murderer. Yes, but you all think that way, and you journalists, etc., and all that. No, reporters, and I said no. Precisely, that's not what I do. We had told him before that in my previous life I'd been a reporter in Vietnam. And then it took me about, I tell you, that's when I really got scared. But what I'd learned in Leipzig, in the area shelter, is to go stone cold when danger arises.
Oh.
And I had this is how I survived Vietnam, this is how I survived combat in Vietnam without a gun in my hand, because journalists are not, reporters are not armed. I got stoned for that, insensate. I didn't feel anything, no fear, no joy. I just did what my reason told me to do. And I calmly talked him out, or talked him into handing me his gun, a 45, so I took the clip out and saw that it was unarmed, handed the gun back to him. I said, one should never take the gun away from a soldier, so you deserve, it's your gun, I'm not stealing it from you. And I put the munition into his pockets and said, don't load him, go back, look after your kids, just pull me out of here and I'll leave you alone. And I wish you God's blessings on your on the rest of your life. These things, the untold stories, there's so many. We lived in New York. For 40 years I had an apartment in New York. Under the bridge, the 59th Street Bridge, we had Vietnamese sleeping there. And all the other neighbors, I mean, it is mid-Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan. People had money, they brought them food, Vietnam veterans, all of them Vietnam veterans. They couldn't socialize with the rest, they were grateful. I brought them wine and some idiot came by and said, God knows what denomination he was. He said, how can you, they're alcoholics anyway, why couldn't you give them something else to drink? I said, don't you think that I should leave them the freedom to drink a good bottle of wine? I'd rather they drink a good bottle of wine than cheap hooch, which is healthy. So we had a good relationship. I had a lot of good discussions with these guys, but they wouldn't even, I invited them to my house, my apartment on 55th Street.
But those are the untold stories, as you said. There are countless of them.
Countless.
And again, I don't think PTSD was called that then.
Oh yes, no, it was. It was not.
It was back then? Okay. Yeah, because we just...
It's in here, in the book, I discuss PTSD.
Because we know that they medicate them.
Yeah.
They become addicts of prescribed medicine or addicts of alcohol or other drugs, but the fact that it's just a cover-up for all that pain and unsolved understanding of what's going on. And so many, I hear also, is that when they really need what you called in there rap groups, but they really need a place to talk about what went on with somebody that understands that, because if they don't air that out, and they say, well, I tried to talk to my dad about it and he said I don't want to hear about anything, well then you just stuff it back. And it just, that, as you said, it just stinks, because it has to be aired out, it has to be told, you have to vent that, because otherwise it'll explode within you. And I think we've done a disservice there.
Yeah, I must tell you a very funny story, strange story. I arrived in St. Cloud in the VA, and one of the guys in my group said, I know you, you won't recognize me. He was a lieutenant colonel at the time. And I said, well, I kicked you out of the camp. They meant it, they were in Vietnam at times. In central Vietnam, there had been heavy duty fighting and jungle fighting, and I went into a special forces camp. I wanted to go there. Now I had West German passport. I was an accredited correspondent. I had the associated rank of a major in the United States Army. War reporters do get associated ranks. Captains, majors, lieutenant colonels, Walter Cronkite, brigadier general. But I mean, you couldn't buy a tomato with it. I mean, but you had that. This is you know, you get,
Right.
for example, priority seating on military aircraft and that
There you
sort
go.
of thing. Anyway, and this guy kicked me out. He said, "Yeah, but I had to stay somewhere. It's war and there's a curfew on. I don't care. You go." I had to spend the night because all the hotels were taken. I had to spend the night in the whorehouse. And not that I needed any of their services, but I needed a bed, and I had a nice bed and a nice room and a good sandwich and a good bottle of beer, and then that was that. You know. So anyway, the guy thought I was an East German spy. You don't sound German. He said to me, "Well, that's not quite true." But I said, "Not all Germans sound like Sergeant Schulze, you know." So you don't sound German. No, you're an East German spy. You're an imposter. I'm not an imposter, Captain. You're the captain. And I remember, kicked me out. No, we made up in the VA in St. Cloud.
You never know who you're going to run into.
No.
Listen, we could talk for longer than this because there's so much in the books and there's so much that you have lived through and continue to do that.
Yeah.
And I know that we didn't touch on the one book, the absurd, the Triumph of the
Well, I
Absurd.
touched on it a little bit.
You did a little bit, but I think that, you know, again, if we have time, another time, what we're going to do is
Sure.
talk about more
Vietnam.
about that and your love of the South Vietnamese people, and also the thought that there's a definite correlation to what's going to happen in the experiences of the people that are coming back from Afghanistan. So I think that has to be another topic, some correlation with that, but I think we need to do that at a different time because we're going to be
Fair
running out of time. How's that?
You'll give me a call.
I will definitely give you a call. It's been
We'll see each other.
absolutely, you always keep me in stitches, and even you can make things that happened during the war, which was an awful time. I would have loved to have met your granny, because she sounds like the kind of woman that we should have more of those, more grandparents, but more mamas and daddies like that.
That is,
as well.
by the way, one of the reasons I thought it was necessary and essential for Americans of this generation to read this book.
Mm-hmm.
It is the significance and the role of grandmothers in the upbringing of the children.
Oh, yes.
I mean, my mother had many talents and all sorts of things. She was quite ditzy too.
But she
It's
wasn't.
grandparents.
Yeah, but that's again, you point out in the book that it wasn't your mother or your father that gave you the examples that you needed, it was your granny.
Which carried me through to this very day.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
imagine, I mean, she was born in the 19th century. I'm spanning, you know,
Yes.
sitting next to a guy spanning 3 centuries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is
And
what
I'm
is
only
so
85.
important.
I mean, that's she's the only guy who doesn't know mathematics.
But again, it's what's happening right now in America with the parents finally standing up and saying, "What are you teaching our children at school?"
Of
It's taken
course.
a long time for them to do that,
Yeah.
but they are rising up. So, but
Thank
then,
God for that, yeah.
yes, thank God for that. But also to see the importance of parental guidance,
Yeah.
upbringing will shape the person you are and throughout life, and that's so vitally important. Anyway, thank you, Uwe.
Thank you, Don.
It's been
All right,
wonderful.
dear.
Thank you so
You
much
too,
again
of
for
course.
being with us. It's been so wonderful, and I'm looking forward to having you back, my dear.
I'll be there.
So don't disappoint.
With polished fingernails.
Oh, yes.
No.
Yeah, no. Okay. Thank you again.